All right, here we go. This is Unit 7, Reproduction. We are at the end of our anatomy and physiology year together. Cannot even believe it. I love ending with the reproductive system because it ties in every system so perfectly. So we're going to start in this concept one, just doing kind of an overview of the reproductive systems as a whole in both males and females. So, what's pretty interesting and unique about the reproductive system, as opposed to all the other systems we've covered this year, is that all of the other systems are playing a role in maintaining homeostasis in the organism. But the reproductive system is really just about giving us the ability to produce offspring. It's not contributing to our ability just to grow and develop and maintain homeostasis on a day to day basis like all the other systems. It's literally completely designed to make our own miniature tiny humans. And it does that by forming specialized cells for reproduction, which are known as gametes or sex cells. And that term should be very familiar from Biology 1, where you should have covered that in detail. In males, the male gametes are sperm and the female gametes are eggs. Hopefully, you remember that as well. A fun fact about gametes is that a human egg is about 30 times larger than a male sperm, which is kind of crazy. And then the reproductive system is not only designed to form these specialized cells, but also to then bring those cells together, those gametes together in sexual intercourse, which is our biological term for that is copulation. From there, hopefully the gametes will fuse in fertilization, and that's where we have a zygote, which again should be a term familiar from Biology 1. That's the first time that the potential offspring has all 46 of its chromosomes, 23 from the male in the sperm and 23 from the female in the egg. And then the reproductive system is also designed specifically in females to support the development of the fetus, which is a process known as gestation, or we often commonly refer to it as pregnancy. And then, of course, the birth of the fetus or parturition. All right, let's talk structures. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the structures in this lecture simply because we're going to learn about them through a set of discovery stations in class because I just don't want to talk your ear off, but I'm going to hit the highlights here. The primary sex organs are the gonads because these are what produce the gametes and also are key sex hormones, which are regulating all of the things. The endocrine system is so integrated with the reproductive. It's crazy. So in males, the primary sex organs or the gonads are the testes or testicles. Again, they're designed to produce gametes, and those gametes are sperm. And then the main sex hormone is testosterone in males. Female gonads are the ovaries. Again, their gametes are the eggs, and then their main sex hormones are estrogens and progesterone. And then, of course, there are accessory structures. There are ducts and glands, and what we more often associate with our reproductive system, which is the external genitalia. But these internal structures, these ovaries and the testes inside the scrotum, those are the main players here in the reproductive system. Okay, so again, like I said, in class, we're going to go through all of these structures through discovery station. So I'm not going to do that here. So just know you have to know all the structures from the discovery stations, even though they're not going to technically be written in our notes. So make sure you pay attention to those. All right, skipping ahead, we're just going to hit some highlights of events and things related to the reproductive system, since all the structures are already covered in the discovery stations. So let's talk about puberty, everyone's favorite topic. Reproduction would not be possible prior to puberty. So this is a really, really important transition in the lives of males and females. Prior to this time in your life, you cannot reproduce. So it's a period of life when your reproductive organs are growing to their adult size and they're also becoming functional. So they're not just getting bigger, they're also getting to the place where they can actually do something. So a major increase in sex hormone secretion is happening during this time. And then that's what yields or creates all of the bodily changes associated with puberty, is because of this massive hormonal cascade. And it involves something called the HPG axis, which should be something we've talked about axes before in terms of hormones. So we'll get to that. But I like this graph because it kind of shows the changes in hormones throughout a male and female's lifetime. Estradiol is just a form of estrogen. So if you're like, what is that? There's a couple types of estrogen. We usually refer to all the estrogens just as estrogen. But you can see in females, estrogen, and in males, really, estrogen in red and then the testosterone in blue, those are increasing pretty steadily throughout childhood and puberty. And then they peak when puberty happens, and then we have them at their highest during the reproductive years. Which vary, but in general, we're talking like 20 to 50 here. And then around 50, females have menopause, which we'll talk about, when the estrogen levels really decrease. But notice testosterone stays high for most of the male's life. If you remember from Biology 1, when we learned about the formation or creation of sperm in meiosis, we talked about how males, after puberty, they can make sperm their whole life. Obviously, they have some prime sperm-making years, but they could continue to make sperm. Whereas females, their reproductive age, they definitely have a reproductive age here. And then you can also see how males also have estrogen and females also have testosterone, but those levels are a bit more even throughout their lifetime. But let's talk about this HPG axis. So HPG, we're talking about hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and G for gonads. So this is a relationship between those three structures, and it's responsible for the reproductive hormone secretion in both males and females. And that's dictating all of these changes that are happening around puberty and just the reproductive process in general. So how kind of this works, the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, which is the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which you may remember, we mentioned this when we talked about the endocrine system in Unit 3, Control and Coordination. So this gets secreted by the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus then stimulates the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior one. This causes the anterior pituitary gland to make gonadotropins, specifically LH and FSH, so the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. So the anterior pituitary gland secretes these, and then this stimulates gamete production and sex hormone secretion, which are going down in the gonads, either the testes or the ovaries. And so then your gonads are then going to make and secrete testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone mainly. And then those will act on different target cells in the body to do a bunch of different things. This creates a negative feedback loop when these sex hormones are secreted back towards the hypothalamus, so that you're not secreting them in insane amounts. So there is like some regulation there with a negative feedback loop. Another hormone that's released by the gonads that plays a role in this negative feedback is inhibin. And it acts on the anterior pituitary gland and how it secretes FSH. But I don't care if you get into all those details, but just know this is a very regulated process, and we're using those feedback loops we talked about all the way back in Unit 1, Intro to Anatomy. Those are still happening and regulating. All right, so let's do a little overview of puberty in males. So FSH, that follicle stimulating hormone, is indirectly stimulating the development of gametes, which are sperm in males, in a process called spermatogenesis. And we're going to go through spermatogenesis in detail in Concept 2, but this is a general picture of what is happening. And hopefully some of this looks familiar. We're seeing things we remember from Biology 1 with the chromosomes duplicating, and we have sister chromatids. And then this is meiosis. So it would happen, we have one meiotic division and then a second meiotic division as well. That luteinizing hormone stimulates interstitial endocrine cells to secrete testosterone, and then that's going to be key for spermatogenesis and getting it all going. But it's also important for the maturation of male sex organs, for their sex drive, and then the development of secondary sex characteristics, which we see really apparent in puberty. So what are those? Those male secondary sex characteristics. That is pubic, axillary, which is like your armpit, and facial hair that you don't have prior to puberty. Some get chest hair, some do not. The larynx in males enlarges, and then that also leads to the deepening of the male's voice. Thicker and more oily skin, which leads to everyone's favorite thing, which is acne. And then increased size and density of bones and increased size and mass of skeletal muscle. So this is where we see those massive growth spurts in males a lot of the time, especially. All right, a puberty or overview for females. That FSH and LH, they stimulate, again, the development of gametes and an increase in secretion of sex hormones. In females, that results in oogenesis or oogenesis, which is just meiosis in females, but we're going to make ovum or egg instead of sperm. It also is going to cause female sex organs to mature in preparation for not just, copulation, but for pregnancy, which is unique to females. The fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina, they're all enlarging so that they would be able to support a pregnancy. And then, of course, the development of female secondary sex characteristics as well, which are different from males. So, yeah, there is the pubic and axillary hair growth, but there's breast development in females. There's an increase in fat, mainly in the hip and breast area, which is why girls get curvier when they've hit puberty. And then other adaptations in their bodies to prepare them for childbirth, such as the widening of the pelvis. And that's where a lot of females get their hips for the first time. And again, we're going to talk about oogenesis in concept 2 more. So just to highlight here. Also, rising estrogen levels do also cause a growth spurt in females, like there's the growth spurt in males. But in females, they reach their maximum height during puberty, which is usually around 13 to 15 years old, but it can definitely be earlier in some girls. But males actually usually don't hit their growth spurt till 15 to 19 years. So that's why we see girls tend to develop and go through puberty and that growth spurt a lot quicker than males do. Okay, a couple more things about puberty in females. Again, adipose or fat tissue, and then the hormone leptin are playing big roles in the onset of female puberty. So, fun fact, girls, your puberty could actually be delayed if you have low levels of fat in the body. So based on body weight. I think a doctor once told me that you have to be at least 90 pounds in order to have enough adipose tissue, essentially, and that hormone leptin to bring about puberty. So that can be delayed if you are really, really small. Sex hormones, those estrogens and progesterone, they're playing a major role, of course, just like the sex hormone of testosterone is in males, but they're playing a role not just in puberty, but in establishing ovarian and uterine cycles in females. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is a monthly cycle, and it's describing the changes in the follicles in the ovary that are going to lead to ovulation, which is the release of an egg once a month from the female ovaries. We also have the uterine or the menstrual cycle. Okay, so these are two different cycles. It's a monthly cycle that describes the changes in the endometrial lining of the uterus as it's preparing for a potential pregnancy to happen. And if that pregnancy doesn't happen, it's going to lead to what we know as menstruation. A female's first menstrual period is known as menarche. And then but it usually takes about 3 years of menstrual periods for a female to have a pretty regulated and consistent cycle, as well as consistent ovulation. So even though a female could technically get pregnant once these cycles have started, it usually takes a couple of years for them for that to go down. Okay, and these cycles are a bit confusing. So we are going to pause in class and do an inquiry activity where we're going to learn more about them, and I think it's going to really help you. But again, for the sake of the notes, we're going to keep just powering through. So some of the highlights of the ovarian cycle, which you're hopefully going to learn about through the inquiry activity, and they'll make a lot more sense then. is that so the cycle is a series of cyclic events that mature one oocyte or oocyte, which is just a premature egg a month. So we're just doing one premature egg a month. Two main parts or phases. We have the follicular phase, which is usually the first 14 days. And this is when these follicles that are nurturing premature eggs, they're growing and then they're secreting estrogen. And one of them is going to get promoted to the dominant follicle, which is going to be ovulated or released. So again, ovulation is when the ovary wall ruptures and it's going to release a secondary oocyte into the peritoneal cavity. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. And then kind of the second phase, so ovulation kind of divides the cycle in half. And then the second phase of the ovarian cycle is this luteal phase. And it's kind of the last 14 days. And it's where you have this mass of cells that forms this thing called the corpus luteum, which secretes very high levels of progesterone and estrogens. And if pregnancy doesn't happen, so if fertilization doesn't happen, all of that, this corpus luteum will start to degenerate about 10 days later and stop producing those hormones. And then that causes the endometrium to begin to erode, which we're going to talk about in the next cycle. So ovulation is typically mid-cycle, again, around day 14. But what's really important to know is that only 15 to 20% of women have 28-day cycles. So that is a very common misconception. It's only like a fifth of women basically do. What can vary is the length of this follicular phase. So it's not always 14 days. But at the end of the follicular phase, maybe you have a 20-day follicular phase, you'd have ovulation and then about a 14-day luteal phase. So the luteal phase is consistently 14 days post-ovulation. And again, only one egg is being released a month. And only 1 to 2% of the time will more than one be released naturally. So when you're ovulating, you're just releasing one egg. Now, there are fertility medications. There's a medication called Clomid, for instance, that can stimulate hyperovulation to try to get you to develop more than one dominant follicle and ovulate that to kind of increase your chances of getting pregnant. But again, only 99% of the time we're releasing one egg a month. Okay, so I think this picture is really helpful. You can see the follicular phase in the beginning. Again, we're using a 28-day cycle just for consistency, but remember this can vary. Ovulation is usually day 14, but it can kind of be any of this in the middle. And then the luteal phase at the end. You can see how the hormones are changing, and hopefully that's something that you saw in the inquiry activity. And then you can see how the follicle develops, and then it can release that oocyte. When ovulation occurs, and then we have this corpus luteum which develops, and then we'll start degenerating if pregnancy doesn't occur. All right, so this is happening at the same time as the uterine or the menstrual cycle, which is a series of cyclic events where the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, the innermost layer of the lining, is going to go through in response to these hormones that are being secreted. So this has 3 phases. Has the menstrual phase, which is, the first 4 or 5-ish days. And that's when menstruation is happening, or your period. The actual term for it is menses. And it occurs when the uterus is just shedding that endometrium, and it thus is accompanied by bleeding. Then we have the proliferative or the pre-ovulatory phase. So that's the rest of the time from when you have your period until when you ovulate, where the endometrium is going to start rebuilding itself in preparation for a potential new pregnancy this new month. And it's doing that in response to rising levels of estrogens. And then after ovulation, the post-ovulatory time is the secretory phase. And that's when the endometrium is preparing for an embryo to implant in response to rising levels of progesterone. And if fertilization and implantation don't occur, then the luteinizing hormone and the progesterone levels, they drop and at the end of the cycle, and then the endometrium will be shed at the beginning of the new cycle, and it all starts again. So I think these next few pictures will really, really help. So this uterine cycle, again, the menstrual phase, you can see the shedding of the endometrium. And then the proliferative phase, you can see it starting to rebuild. See it rebuilding here, and then it's getting thicker and thicker. And then again, if there isn't implantation here of a fertilized embryo or fertilized egg, then we're going to go back to the beginning and shed it again. You can see it down here as well. So the beginning of the month is when the start of your cycle is the start of your period. We can see the shedding of the endometrium. That's your menstrual flow. And then it starts to look at how the endometrium starts to build itself up again in preparation for a fertilized egg to implant in it. And then when that doesn't happen, then again, we start over again at day 1 and it starts to shed and rebuild itself again. And then this picture kind of shows how it's all happening at the same time. So this endometrium is building up after, again, ovulation around day 14. This peak hormones, that's when we should see this really going down. Then we have the corpus luteum forming. If that doesn't happen, if pregnancy again isn't going to happen, then this starts to go down again. There's also a relationship between your basal body temperature and these phases. So if you're trying to get pregnant and you're doing some fertility tracking, one of the things you can track is your basal body temperature. Basically, you take your body temperature first thing in the morning, and what we often see is that it is below a certain threshold prior to ovulation, and then after ovulation has occurred, it kind of spikes, and it's only a couple tenths of a degree, but it's a big enough change, and then it stays high until, a new cycle begins. So if you get pregnant, a new cycle doesn't begin, so it'll stay relatively high. But if you were about to start your period in a new uterine cycle, then that temperature would drop again. So that's what the relationship is there with that temperature. Okay, last thing is menopause. So females have their first menstrual period, which we said is menarche, at the onset of puberty. And this continues, each month, about once a month, until their late 40s or early 50s. And then their periods start to become more erratic. They become shorter. They're not consistently ovulating. And essentially, they're just losing their reproductive abilities. So menopause is what we say is the period in a female's life when she's just no longer having a menstrual period. And to kind of declare menopause, you basically have to have a year without a period pass before it's considered to have been reached, menopause to have been reached. So this graph shows changes in estrogen and progesterone over a female's lifetime. Again, they're pretty high, and then we can really see them dipping. And then especially by age 60, they're much lower. And then here is another picture as well that's showing like peak hormone levels in puberty. When you're fertile, they are high, but they do get lower the older you're getting in those 30s and 40s. Then you have menopause, and then you have postmenopause, which is when they just get even more and more low. All right, and that is our overview of the reproductive system.